miracles can happen. There's no doubt about that. And you got up early to come to this event. I'm Steve Cheney. I'm the president of the American Security Project, formerly CEO for the last 8 years plus. We're an interesting organization, 501c3. We support a number of initiatives here. Our focus is national security. And the way we started in 2004, 2005 was after the election, a couple of senators were not happy with the result, Kerry being one of them. They decided that maybe we could get some folks to be spokespeople for the issues that we're talking about that would be non-political. And their thought was to grab what we call flag officers, admirals and generals, 3- and 4-star, 2 from each service, recently retired, and let them talk about things like nuclear weapons and their proliferation, which we were big fans of New START, energy security, and climate change. And climate change has been one of our big issues now for a number of years. And so that has held on throughout the time. Our current chairperson is Christine Todd Whitman, former governor of New Jersey, Republican, former administrator of the EPA. And we're taking these issues on one at a time. And today's topic, of course, we think is pretty timely. Battlefields of the future, the next generation of nuclear reactors. And I'm going to have my moment to shine here and talk about that here in a minute, but the important person here is Congressman Connor Lamb. And I was just talking to the congressman, and he's had an interesting year and a half, and congratulations on your election. You've had 2, as I understand it, in the last year plus, and then another one coming up. This is the land of everlasting elections, I'm sure. But we're delighted that you're here. And I will tell you, they take me hard to do the introduction, they said, because I'm a retired Marine, and you are a Marine, active duty, well, IRR, but you've just come off active duty. And I know you're a University of Pennsylvania graduate. I have a connection there. My sister got her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. She now teaches at Pomona. Fabulous school. And the fact that the number of committees that you're sitting on, I see the list here, Vice Chair of the House Committee on Veterans Affairs. You're Chair of the Energy Subcommittee on the House Committee of Science, Space, and Technology. So I mean, and you're working on Veterans Affairs as well, Vice Chair. So those are all very important committees and important to us here at ASP. We are not a lobbying organization per se, but we will go up to the Hill and talk policy. We won't endorse a candidate or a party, but we will criticize or endorse a policy. And certainly we're concerned about energy independence and nuclear energy, which we are proponents of, as long as it's done in a safe and quiet way. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the congressman and let you make your remarks, and then you can go back up to the Holocaust on the Hill.
Thank you, sir, and thank you, Andrew, for allowing me to be here. The real reason they invited a Western Pennsylvanian on this morning of all mornings is that I was told you need some experience in preparing for winning sports championships. And that is something that we know a lot about in our part of the country. It's a lot of fun winning. It's really good for morale and for the whole feeling of the city. So look forward to it. I hope it happens to you. The important thing about Western Pennsylvania, and I've represented a large swath of it in the past 18 months in 2 different districts. Thank you to our Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Oil was first discovered there by Edwin Drake in 1859. Our coal helped power the industrial machine that fought and won World War I and World War II and on throughout the 20th century. In 1954, President Eisenhower waved the wand that broke ground on the first ever civilian commercial nuclear reactor in my current district in a place called Shippingport, Pennsylvania, about 25 or 30 miles outside of Pittsburgh. And today it's the shale boom in Western Pennsylvania, in addition to 1 or 2 other places, that is really rewriting the American national security strategy and posture for the 21st century. So we feel pretty proud of our history of energy development and energy production in Western Pennsylvania, and we're looking forward to the 21st century and how we can contribute just like anybody else is. I think what nuclear and shale developments have in common, as far as I can tell, is that they represent the best of what this federal government of ours can do when it sets its mind to it, which is to invest heavily in R&D, make some excellent choices, and deploy the resources at our disposal, both in the military and in our national lab system, and in doing so, break open new markets that American entrepreneurs can rush in and fill and create American jobs. The nuclear program is a perfect example of that. Admiral Rickover and President Eisenhower and everyone in between invested heavily in doing it on the Navy side and on the commercial side, and an entire new industry was born, a worldwide industry. And companies like Westinghouse, which are native to Western Pennsylvania, spent the rest of the 20th century developing this technology and creating jobs and creating affordable clean energy all over the world. The same is now true with shale. Not everybody knows this, but a lot of the technologies behind shale development, whether hydraulic fracturing or horizontal drilling, or even the seismic detection that goes into that technology now, almost all of it was developed or significantly added to within our national lab system, much of it at the national lab in Western Pennsylvania. We're very proud of this. Certainly entrepreneurs came in and took risks and took it further than the government could take it, but this was a new market created and expanded by our communal efforts and the tax dollars that we all spend. Interestingly though, today, it's the intersection of these two things, shale and nuclear, that is threatening the future of nuclear energy in Pennsylvania. So we get 40% of our power in Pennsylvania from nuclear power today. But we just lost the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant, and the plant in my district, which is called Beaver Valley, it's the successor to the original shipping port plant, is next on the list to be at risk of closing. Why is that? Well, there are a lot of complicated reasons to it. Obviously, the plants are old, but the number one reason is that natural gas is extremely cheap in Pennsylvania because of the shale development boom we've had there. And so people can build gas plants and get power even cheaper for the ratepayers. And so we're grappling with this question in our home state of what do we do to recognize the contribution that nuclear energy makes to a carbon-free power sector in the United States. And it's a question we have to take seriously because in Pennsylvania at least, it is 100% clear that if we lose Beaver Valley and we lose any of our other nuclear plants, they'll be replaced by natural gas and fossil fuel sources. We'll go back when we're trying to go forward on climate, and we don't want to allow that. So there are people working today in Pennsylvania because of these choices that our government has made in the past, and we need the government to make similar choices going forward. Just at the plant in my district alone that I mentioned, we have 1,000 people working every day. And across our state, that number is more like between 10 and 15,000, just the plants alone. Many of these people are union members, and a pretty high percentage of them are veterans of the United States Navy as well. And their jobs should not be at risk. They have made an incredible contribution to the power sector and the economy of our state. And many of them are people working in middle-class jobs in parts of the state where we haven't had a lot of success replacing the middle-class jobs that left when steel and coal and other aspects of heavy industry resigned. So many people would find it ironic that two Marines such as General Cheney and myself have been called upon to defend these Navy veterans today and their jobs, but let me assure you that that's just the latest in a long history of the Marines doing the dirty work the Navy can't do for themselves. So we all know we need to look forward, and I think as part of this same history that we're talking about of the government breaking open these new markets for American entrepreneurs, we all believe that we stand on the doorstep of a new era of nuclear energy if we choose to seize it, and that's with advanced, small, fast micronuclear reactors. So I'm proud to be one of the original co-sponsors in the House of something called the Nuclear Energy Leadership Act, which also is led in the Senate by Senators Manchin and Murkowski. And this is an audacious bill, and I think if we get this right, we may look back in the future at this being another turning point like it was when Rickover and Eisenhower decided to take on nuclear energy for the first time. What our bill would do would authorize long-term power purchase agreements. So right now, we allow federal agencies to purchase and build new energy projects for about 10 years of guaranteed power purchasing. We would extend that to 40 years to make it even easier to build and develop a complicated technology like the future of nuclear. We would also set specific goals for our advanced nuclear reactor research. We would require the Secretary of Energy to establish a nuclear energy strategic plan. We would do a lot of research on versatile reactor-based fast neutron sources, which is the science underlying some of these fast reactors. We would also advance the state of security for our nuclear fuels. And perhaps most importantly, we would establish a university nuclear leadership program to bring along the next generation of scientists to replace many of those who are starting to retire. We have done a great job with the nuclear pipeline in our country, and I think we could do a whole lot more. It's going to take people. It's going to take a guaranteed customer in the form of the federal government. But again, I believe that's the role we've always played at our most successful, the federal government using its own market and buying and research power to establish this market and help it make transition. On top of all of this, whether you're talking about life extension for current plants, whether you're talking about the AP1000 that we're already selling abroad, or you're talking about these future technologies, I've heard estimates that we're looking at least a $1 trillion export market when it comes to nuclear technology, which makes sense because there's still 1 billion people in the world today without electric power, at least reliably. And their governments are looking around the world and trying to figure out where they can get it, how they can get it fast and at an affordable rate. And in many of these countries, they don't want to contribute to climate change any more than they have to. And what's happening today is Russia and China are filling those gaps. I think we owe it to all the Americans I talked about and all the Americans growing up today in those same places to seize those jobs and those opportunities for them. We have tens of thousands of additional people in the state of Pennsylvania who work in the nuclear supply chain. There's a company called Curtiss-Wright in my district that employs members of the United Steelworkers and IBEW, and they make both turbines and rotors and big steel objects for Navy ships and their nuclear supplies, as well as domestic nuclear power plants. And they have so many Chinese customers, I went and toured there this summer, that they actually have tarps hung on their walls and ceiling preset in place so that they can cover up all the sensitive domestic military technology when the Chinese come in to look at the replacement parts for the AP1000s they bought from us. So that's the world. China will buy this stuff from us, and so will all these other countries if we do it better. I believe we can, and that's the goal of our legislation. So I thank you for all the awareness you're bringing to this issue. I hope you'll reach out to my office and others who are involved in this topic area and help us move it along. Our door is always open. Thank you very much.
We're going to bring up Andrew Holland, my Chief Operating Officer, and formally bring the panel together. And I'll let that.
Plenty of time. But apparently out at Dulles, the trams were not working today. So, so we're going to go ahead and get started while she is in transit here, and when she comes, she'll come right up and be a part of it. But meanwhile, we were so lucky and honored to have Representative Connor Lamb come here and tell us and talk to us about the work he's doing, the work that's being done in Congress. And I think it is notable that nuclear power, advanced nuclear, is having a moment right now in Congress. There is bipartisan support for a lot of things that are moving in the advanced nuclear space. In the today's nuclear power, yesterday's nuclear power is not the same as tomorrow's nuclear power. Things are changing. That's not to say that there's anything, that these current generation is anything wrong. We want to do everything we can to keep the current generation going as long as we can, because as he said, that is the largest part of our zero carbon energy source, and losing that would be a real challenge. But the next generation of nuclear power is quite different and quite interesting. So what we're here today to talk about is nuclear power for the military. As many of you know, there has been a couple of programs up and running within the Department of Defense to look at how we'd use these new next generation nuclear power for the military, how to increase our national security, our operational effectiveness in there. And I'm going to, we've just published this report here, and I think many of you have picked up copies of it. You'll see it go out in the press release this afternoon, and we're excited to push this out. But I think to kind of look at this, the way we look at this, the way I see this is energy is what you could call a force multiplier. It allows the military to be more effective. It allows the military to be more lethal and bring more power, literally, to the fight. You don't hear the term much in this administration, but you still see the effects. In the last administration, they had talked about this third offset strategy. And what an offset means is the military taking advantage of both a technology advance with a strategic shift. So it allows the military to cost effectively balance against competition. And you know, when they talk about this, the first offset was in the 50s using advances in nuclear weapons to offset against the conventional superiority of the Soviet military in Europe. The idea that we would never be able to stop Soviet tanks, but with nuclear weapons, you could offset against that and deter it. The second offset in this sort of context was the computing, stealth, and precision weapons developed throughout the 1970s that allowed the U.S. military to offset against, again, Soviet military, dominance in manpower. You know, the idea that you could, if you could use less bombs and be more strategic and more accurate, you could do a lot more damage. And of course, that offset kind of culminated in the first Gulf War, and you saw it almost looked like the video game that they would talk about. You're knock that against there. So the third offset, the idea is that technology advances in data analytics, AI, autonomy, directed energy, hypersonics, biotech, all of those would help offset against this new age of strategic competition with China and Russia. What I think was notable, though, and I talked about this a little bit when I first talked about this, but notable even more now, is that energy was not included in that conversation. And of course, energy is the thing that enables almost all of those other things. You know, hypersonics, directed energy. Of course, you need a massive amount of directed energy. Autonomous vehicles. A lot of those are electrical powered. You even see things like, the Army is now talking about using a all-electric brigade. So these things require vast amounts of power, and largely it's vast amounts of electric power. And so the thing is, though, is that the way the military generates that electricity on the battlefield and at installations is the same way it's generated that energy for a long, long time. So maybe we should be thinking about how to utilize advances in energy to do this. And of course, we've seen over the last decade and a half, new advances in solar power, in batteries, and that sort of stuff on the battlefield, and that is very important. It gets fuel off the supply lines, off the supply chain. But when you talk about these massive amounts of power, really only nuclear can meet those energy needs. Energy dense, doesn't have the long supply chain, the long supply lines that you have with fossil fuels, with oil, gas, diesel going up into battlefield areas. So that's kind of what I talk about in the report there. There's a lot more in there, so I'd encourage you all to read it. But I think it's important, too, to get some context from General Cheney, who has thought a lot about these issues based on his time in the Marines and since. So, Steve, over to you.
Absolutely, Andrew, and maybe we can get a quick dialogue going here.
Yeah.
I love your comment that power is a force multiplier. I'd call it more of an Achilles heel.
Yeah.
Because without it, you're not going anywhere. When I was an artillery battalion executive officer, we were out in the desert. My number one concern wasn't the ammunition or where the enemy was. Where's the next gas stop? How was I going to get gas and the fuel to power our battalion so that we could get on the way? and without it, you're dead. Once you stop it, you're targeted, and they're going to get you. So there's no doubt about it. Power is essential to any battlefield environment. I got to take a side swipe at the Navy while I'm at it. I heard the congressman's comments. I have the Navy to thank for being a Marine, because I couldn't make it to the Rickover interview, and which is what I wanted. I was a Marine engineer by degree, and didn't quite qualify on the grade point average side of the house. So I went into the Marines, and was happy for it, to be honest with you. But we have the Navy to thank for nuclear power today. And when people think nuclear power, they think Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, when they ought to be thinking about the 60 or 70 nuclear reactors we've got underneath the water and that we have on our surface line ships that are nuclear powered. And the advantage that gives them, unlike the disadvantage I had in my artillery battalion, is they can operate for 20 years without refueling. I mean, and as General Mattis said when he was the commanding general of the 1st Marine Division, get me off this tether of fossil fuels. The statistic used is that there were over 1,000 soldiers, sailors, and airmen Marines that were killed between Iraq and Afghanistan guarding fuel convoys, which is incredible, to be honest with you. They had over 18,000 other casualties related to convoy patrols. So when you're carting all these fossil fuels around to power and run your organizations, you know it's a huge vulnerability. I will translate this to another anecdotal story. I was the commanding general at Parris Island, and Parris Island is indeed an island. The only way you get there is by an isthmus or a causeway that goes there. And that's where the power line comes across, entirely dependent on a local grid for power. And if we had a severe thunderstorm, of which they get several during the summer, the power would go out, we'd shut down the base. In the heat of the summer, you've probably got 8,000 or 9,000 recruits on that base. You can't just shut down operations. Our backup was an oil-fired power plant that was built in World War II. And I was telling folks earlier, if you've driven on Parris Island, you see these old steam lines running all over the base, up above the base. I mean, the old, antiquated, a huge vulnerability. I would have gone crazy to have a small modular reactor that powered that base and kept us going on my own without dependence on the local grid. And as you're probably familiar, there are a number of initiatives with the Department of Defense for go to net zero, meaning bases that would produce more power than they consume, and some are on the way to do that. In my opinion, one of the easiest ways to do that is the small modular reactors. If you had them at all these bases, what an advantage it would have to those base commanders. So the logistical side of it is phenomenal. We at the American Security Project are pro-nuclear power. And I mentioned earlier that we're anti-nuclear weapons. I won't get into that today. We're big on the New START treaty and that whole business. But nuke power is a whole different story. And we are also pro-fusion. If you follow the fusion thing, the rap on fusion, of course, is they've been saying for 30 years, it's 30 years away. Whereas the technology on nuclear power is here today and it's proven. It can be done. Small modular reactors, the designs are there. The funding is not. And if you had the funding to get them established, and I know there are programs with the Department of Defense today that need to be pushed on the Hill to help subsidize these programs and give our commanders in the field the advantages that you would have for nuclear power on your bases and stations. They need it desperately, and like I said, I know that technology is there, unlike fusion, which, again, we're fusion proponents, but that's not here yet. Nuke power is here today, and the Navy has been doing it for 60 or 70 years, all the way along the time. Today, we are so dependent on energy. You would think, I mean, the military is going more and more to electric vehicles. You look at the aircraft carriers now, they're talking about having electric catapults. Everything is leaning towards the electric side of the house and getting away from the fossil fuel side. So all our targeting, when I was an artillery battalion commander, all your commands that went down to the batteries are done over communication links. All your computing was done on computers. You all had the power for that. And if that power went out, you went back to manual. And literally still today at Fort Sill, which is the Army's basic artillery school, the backup is you learn how to manually compute all your data, which takes forever. And it's a tremendous disadvantage. But they're told if your power goes out, you better be able to do it on your own without having to depend on a power source, which is smart, but ultimately it's not the solution to this problem. So I know where people come from talking about nuclear power, but I think today when you get around to it, and you look at the percentage of power provided in the United States by nuclear power and worldwide, and their safety record, and again, when I talked about the original three there, everybody goes back to that. I can tell you there have been far more deaths associated with coal mining and coal-fired power plants than there ever have in the nuclear industry. But people tend to brush over that statistic and need to get back on the nuclear side. So I know there are solutions to this. I was glad to hear the congressman up here talk about it. We've got support on the Hill. There is legislation pending. I know there are initiatives within the Department of Defense that we need to push, that we need to get going, that we need to shove downstream and at least get them off the dime to give our commanders the flexibility that they'll have and the independence that they would have for a small modular reactor. So with that, I'll flip it back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Steve. And you know, we'll kind of have a little conversation here until Caroline comes, and then she can jump right in. We can open up for questions too if we get to there. I want to talk a couple of sort of definitions that you hear bumped around within the Pentagon. So there's energy security and energy resilience, and obviously they're two sides of the same coin, right? But if you think about it, so energy security is what they say, having assured access to reliable supplies of energy and the ability to protect and deliver sufficient energy to meet mission essential requirements. On the other side, energy resilience is the ability to avoid, prepare for, minimize, adapt to, and recover from anticipated and unanticipated energy disruptions. The way that works, kind of in practice, is energy security is more towards the battlefield. Being able to have the power you need at the battlefield in order to deploy your force, kind of be unleash us from the tether field that you mentioned. But the energy resilience then is the ability to bounce back from either an attack or other unanticipated storm, something like that. And so that kind of tends towards the more installation side. And, when we talk about the offsets and the increased technologies and everything like that the military is using, resilience is incredibly important because all of these things run on a huge amount of power. There is, think about our missile defense systems that the Air Force uses. These things have to always be on, right? Because a missile's only up for a little while. And so the radars, missile defense have to always be on. And you'd think, I think it's pretty clear that should there be any sort of attack from North Korea, Iran, other sorts of, in terms of ballistic missiles, it would be preceded by some sort of asymmetric attack, right? So whether it's a cyber attack or EMP burst or something that would knock out your power systems. And the idea with energy resilience here is that a stationary nuclear power plant, micro-nuclear power plant, would be separated from grid, would be separated from cyber attacks, would be resilient against these sorts of things. It wouldn't be a question of getting it back on. It would be just a question of it wouldn't go off. So that there's this, and then the other side is on the energy security. It's about getting the power plants to the base, or getting it to the fight. Can you? And I think it's really interesting that the design that the Pentagon has talked about is to be able to put a nuclear power plant inside of a standard shipping container. So that means you can put it on a ship, put it on a rail, put it on an airplane. And that is, I understand that's quite a challenge for design purposes. These things have to be pretty resilient, pretty built up to be able to withstand shocks from landing on an airplane and being jostled around on a rail car. So it's an important design challenge, but I think it's really critical and important that the DoD is actually working on this, is pushing industry to work on this. I thought Representative Lamb had a good way to think about this, that this is all of these things. When we think about energy, when we think of technology development, it is federal investment, federal dollars that go into there, and how that has driven a lot of the investment that then is taken and commercialized from there. So, this idea of resilience versus security, I think, is important, and it really is kind of two nuclear programs that they're looking at. There's the resilience side is maybe more towards Air Force operations, that sort of stuff, space operations, but not exclusively. And the mobile side is more towards expeditionary operations, so Marines or especially Army is the one that's looking towards it.
Andrew, you talk about dependency on local grid and what a vulnerability that is for our bases and stations. Just look at last week when they shut down the power outside of San Francisco. Yeah. If they did that outside of Camp Pendleton, shut down Camp Pendleton, you'd have to shut down that base.
Yeah.
And they've had, we've always had forest fires or range fires at Camp Pendleton, but not like they've had in the last couple of years. So my point to this is the dependence on the local grid is becoming worse. Mm-hmm. And we all know the infrastructure story, and Congress needs to help us on the infrastructure side of the house. But that's not being solved immediately, whereas our bases and stations are still vulnerable. So having the independence of having your own power source is so much better than depending on the local community on the power side of the house. And again, we've got, if not hundreds, maybe thousands, military bases throughout this country and all over the world that we could power with this type of source without having to depend on the local grid. So again, the advantages that it offers on the base and station side of the house is a plus. A lot of times when I talk at ASP about climate change in terms of vulnerabilities, I talk strategic and what's going on worldwide, and then I talk tactical about bases and stations here in the United States. It's not dissimilar to this argument either. When you talk strategic and our dependency on fossil fuels worldwide, which is a huge vulnerability, then bring it back to our bases and stations that are here in the continental United States, definitely need a secure and reliable power source. And to me, right now, the only answer is small modular reactors.
Yeah, small, these next generation nuclear reactors. While we're waiting for Caroline to come, I can open it up to questions and comments from the audience. When you do, I think we do have a microphone that'll come around, so please wait for that. We are filming this. Please identify yourself when you ask a question, and then we'll see what we can do to answer it. But I think I see ma'am in the back there.
Hi, Sharon Squassoni from George Washington University. I think it's important to distinguish between reactors that might support domestic U.S. bases, where I understand it's actually the grid issue. It's not really it's transmission and distribution. But in terms of foreign bases, how do you square two big issues? One is getting foreign countries to either how to square this with their regulations or getting permission to transport these microreactors, which I guess you're going to be transporting them fueled. And the other is how you square this with the technology advances of high precision targeting. So these, it's one thing to have fuel supplies blown up. It's another thing to have reactors blown up.
Right. Exactly right. Two important challenges. And so the first is that you have to start, should start figuring out right away to have State Department involved in engaging and talking to the local partners, places where you might put these. Because, it is certainly a thing that you have to be aware of, but at the same time, our nuclear Navy does go all around the world, go to port calls all around the world, and it is the same sort of issue. So you do have to be aware of this. You should be engaging. You should be working on that, and that's important. It's on your question of targeting. So yes, this is something that has to be looked at and we have to be aware of. The the DoD anticipates that these microreactors would be fueled by this new fuel source called TRISO, tristructural isotopic particle. So with that, the fuel would be fabricated inside these small kernels that encapsulated with carbon and ceramics. The idea is that this TRISO fuel is resistant to meltdown, ability to withstand extreme temperatures, and it should minimize the release of fissile or irradiated material from battle damage. And so it needs to be tested. These things are important, needs to be tested. These do need to be protected. It's a part of the DoD's their request for information and request for proposal is a plan for testing of these. So it is something to think about and something to worry about. It's not, you have to be aware of these and you have to look at it. I am pretty confident that you can do these without irradiating the battlefield. But
I'm sure it's a great question, and that's why I talked about strategic and tactical and then continental United States. I don't envision hauling around 100 small modular reactors within 20 miles of the forward edge of the battle area. I think what I do envision, for instance, though, is having one, for instance, at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, where you're protected and you know you can protect it. It's land, it's stationary. We can put up enough guard around them, whereas hauling them to the front line in Syria, for instance, is not something I would envision here. I just don't see it. And the example of the Navy, the Navy more than seriously protects its submarines and ships. I mean, they go out with a task force that's hundreds of miles wide, and you'd have to do something similar to guard such a reactor on land as well. So that would be a distinct vulnerability in the battle area. But here with your permanent bases and stations, it's a different story. You've got permanent forces stationed there. And we got major bases throughout Europe and the Middle East. You could certainly power them with a nuclear small modular reactor.
yeah, and when we talk about energy security too, and the vulnerability of supply lines, we've gotten the message out pretty well that the Army and Marine and land forces are there's a vulnerability of their supply lines. But I don't think the message has gotten out there that the Navy is going to have similar vulnerabilities in the case of any sort of action with China, for instance. Guam, Okinawa are island bases that will be important parts of that. And I think the Chinese have very clearly seen our troubles with protecting our supply lines on land, and certainly any fuel supplies or anything like that going into these bases during any action would be a target. So I think whatever you can do to reduce your energy supply lines in that case would be important in a way to, certainly those would be a centralized place that is already heavily protected and would be an ideal place to put these sort of centralized power. So, ma'am, right here.
Good morning. This is Andrea Janetta with S&P Global Platts. You mentioned the Department of Defense's, I guess it's a request for information from micro-reactor developers. I'm wondering if Carolyn was here, I'd be asking her. But I'm wondering if you have any sense of when the Defense Department will announce who the two candidates they've selected are, and what the next step is, because we're all waiting for that.
I think it's passed the RFI and gone to an RFP, or some of you in the audience probably know better than me. Yeah, there you go. So a few months. There you go. And we're all eagerly anticipating and aware of it. It's an important it's incredibly important to have the DoD support, the support from SCO here into this, because there is research that needs to be done. We shouldn't think that these are ready to deploy tomorrow. These require new research and development. Federal government can and should lead on these, and it's because it's a national security priority. It's important and appropriate for the DoD to push and support on this. So we're eagerly anticipating and looking forward to that. We can do one more question, sir, right here.
Joel Federer with the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Energy, and we fund a couple microreactor designs.
RPD, sure.
My question for you is, obviously this is a strategic priority for the United States. I'm sure it is as well for some of our adversaries. What's your understanding of what foreign governments are doing in the area of microreactors as they apply to military?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I noted one of my hobby areas of research is Arctic. And I noted, and maybe you all did as well, that the Russians floated a floating nuclear reactor this summer in the Arctic. They have plans for 7 or 8 more. And these things, they say, are for, and truly are for, resource exploitation, for powering new ports and all that sort of stuff. But I'd also note that the Russians have invested heavily in their military bases in the Arctic, and so similar things like that. So the Russians are building these. I'd note that when we think about safety issues, the Russian safety standards in nuclear reactors are not nearly as good as ours. Their commercial have since Chernobyl been fine, but if you look at hear some of the stories about the Soviet nuclear navy and how, basically they treated their Arctic as a dumping ground for a lot of things. What I'd want is for American technology to take the lead on these and to be the standard globally. The Chinese have announced plans as well. They are particularly interested in them for their South China Sea bases, for the small rocks that have been turned into larger islands and our military bases. They've talked about putting up to 20 across their island bases in the South China Sea. Again, they're not going to be shy about selling that to their partners and to their around the world. So again, I think it's important that the United States take a lead on this. And with that, we're very pleased to have Caroline Cochran, COO of Oklo, join us here.
Yes.
I hope your trip in was okay and got a little bit of sleep last night.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. And so we've had a good conversation here about the national security need for microreactors on bases and deployable around the world. And we had Representative Connor Lamb come and talk about why this is important for his district in western Pennsylvania and why it's important that the federal government leads on this. So I think your thoughts and ideas here on what you all are doing and what you all see as potential markets and benefits of your design, and anything else you want to add would be really a valuable addition to the conversation. So thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and so sorry for the delay. You probably heard I was subbed in last minute, flew overnight from California, and then the plane was delayed by an hour and so forth, so it all compounded. But I'm really happy to be here today. It's really important to us to be able to speak to this audience, and really appreciate you guys hosting this conversation, this very important conversation. I wanted to really quickly touch on some of the things that you were talking about just a moment ago. There are other countries currently operating microreactors right now. We talk about it like it's a theoretical thing in the future, but Russia itself is actually operating microreactors in Siberia right now to provide power to small communities. There is a market there, and you're asking, to speak a few words about why we're in this space. We saw that there's a real need in a lot of remote areas, and there are exploding uses of microgrids around the world, not just in developing countries, but even on grids. Being from California, it's been interesting to see how we're trying to deal with widespread power outages or forced power outages in some cases. And people are starting to return to trying to have diesel generators at their houses. So we're also on a grid there in California where it's a large grid, but it still costs between 20 and 30 cents a kilowatt hour in California for the power at my house and at our office. Granted, that's retail and so forth, but you're already seeing grids that are in higher cost areas that are starting to look at how come individual communities are interested in both going carbon free but also reducing their power costs. And to the extent that they can create their own grid, their own pricing, and opt into power that they want to see being built in their community, that's a real power of looking at nuclear on such a small scale. So we saw this need years ago when we were talking to people both in resource extraction companies as well as some Alaskan friends that we ran into, and we're talking about it, and we were saying, they're talking about how there are places they can't even get power because in some areas in Alaska they're burning 9 gallons of diesel to get 1 gallon of diesel to the location in the first place, and then of course that's not very clean or cheap power in those areas. And in some places they can't even, it's just not even feasible. Many areas have to close down during the winter, or they are under what we call energy poverty. So it's just too expensive for people to afford their energy. Here in the mainland United States, I think we're more likely to take for granted the cost of power here, but there it's a real ongoing concern. So we saw this market need and decided to develop a microreactor. I don't think we were really using the term microreactor back then, but started really developing this. Certainly there's incredible value to, I think, America's security for developing this. Not just, the topic of conversation today is more focused, it seems like generally on use in defense purposes and making sure we have energy security on bases around in the United States and around the world. But there is just broadly a sense of America needs to be on the table here. We need to be, at the table, forgive me. We need to be at the table because we can't try to lead in certain areas, whether it's security, non-proliferation, or energy dominance, if we're not even at the table. So we see this constantly. It's kind of an interesting tug and pull between the United States regulator, which wants as much as possible reasonably to be public, and the various agencies in the United States that want to make sure that technology stays within the United States and make sure that it stays private. So for us as a small company, it's a constant battle, but we see these stakes high and maybe even getting higher as we go along. We had, 2 months ago, I was at an export controls summit where there was someone from the FBI who wouldn't identify himself who was talking about situations they wanted the broader community to be aware of, and it was actually the first time, I guess, the FBI had spoken at such a convention. But they're seeing attacks from China. They're seeing them trying to replicate what we're trying to do, even though we haven't even yet had a market yet. And I think once we do start selling microreactors commercially, that kind of threat will continue and intensify. So we have international actors that have interest in beating us at this stage, and I think there's incredible benefits to the United States if we lead. So that's a little synopsis.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Could you, I'm curious, and I think our audience might be, to learn a little bit about your idea for the design. What does this look like? How is it being built, and how do you deal with the challenges of nuclear that we all know about?
Absolutely. I think generally you can kind of look at nuclear reactor designs, and they've on average been on the order of 1,000 megawatts or electric or so, or at least hundreds. And I think a lot of small designs have looked at how can we shrink that down. We try to look at taking small reactors and kind of starting from there. So space reactor kind of history, using heat pipes and scaling that up for different microgrid needs. and tried to really assess what was the key design point to place that electricity size at. What we saw, these remote communities were really wanting very, very small power, or if they wanted more, they wanted some redundancy. So we tried to stick to what we call single-digit megawatt electric, so between 1 and 2 megawatts electric. It could kind of be customized for the site. What we're using as far as technology for fuel is based on something that was actually developed in the United States for 30 years. And many even nuclear engineers haven't even heard of this, which is incredible. But for 30 years, we operated a research reactor here in the United States using this advanced fuel. And in fact, the same year as Chernobyl, which you were pointing out, they performed tests where they had it at full power, shut off all the cooling, and locked the control rods out of the core so it couldn't shut itself down, and then waited to see what would happen. And it's a little bit of a simplification, but the general physics of the situation was that the metal fuel heats up, it expands, and it shuts down the reaction. So there's kind of this inherent physical characteristic that you can take advantage of that keeps it safe. And is actually incredibly robust and reliable. Like I said, it was operated for 30 years. We have loads of data on around 100,000 fuel pins, and so that's the basis. And so that's the kind of the type of technology we're using. Metal fuel for the fuel and heat pipes to carry the heat out, and then the power conversion side can be kind of plug and play based on the application.
Very cool. Well, I think we can open up for a couple more questions. We had a couple of questions from the audience as you were going, but we can open up for a couple more here, either to me or General Cheney or to Caroline. And go sir over here.
Hi, my name is Steve Trumbull. I'm with Aviation Week magazine. I'm not in the nuclear field. But the Air Force has talked about using nuclear reactors as power sources for their agile basing concept, especially out in the Pacific in remote areas. I wondered about some of the questions that you answered already, but what about nuclear waste? What kind of waste do these reactors generate, and how do you treat them?
Yeah, it's a good question. That will have to be determined. I'd note that the Navy has a long history of once their naval reactors are emptied and fueled, they ship it to Idaho National Lab, and it goes into a repository there. Caroline, maybe how have you all thought about what you do with the spent fuel?
Yeah. So going back to what we use as the basis of our technology, that reactor that operated in Idaho for 30 years actually demonstrated reuse of fuel. And that's another big part of what makes us excited about this technology, is demonstrating recycling used fuel or waste as energy and turning it into energy. So there's really interesting papers that you can read about how that was done. It doesn't even require reprocessing in the traditional sense. It's called a melt, recast, recycle kind of process. So in fact, it might be the case that our first core load is a recycled fuel from that reactor from 30 years ago. So instead of having it just sit around as waste, we can turn it into energy and demonstrate a new concept. So we're really excited about that. I think one of the things I'm seeing broadly, as I speak honestly a fair amount now, is I think we're getting to this point in environmental consciousness and thinking about resources that we have within this country and making the most of them, that we realize that everything is waste. I think people are growingly concerned about pollution and deaths caused by pollution due to different forms of energy. So nuclear by far has the lowest carbon footprint and the lowest amount of waste per energy produced, right? So granted, there are concerns about the lifetime of waste, and that's why we're excited about being able to reuse the waste and reduce the lifetime significantly. So we're not talking about thousands of years, we're talking about a few hundred years, and it's relatively easy to store it at that point. But what we're really excited about is, if you think about nuclear power as a fission as a power source, fission, if your life was powered by it, your entire lifetime supply of energy would fit in the palm of your hand. We say about a pop can or Coke can size. So that's your entire lifetime as an American citizen, using more than the average world citizen as far as energy. So it's incredibly energy dense, around 2 million times more energy dense, give or take different factors, but than a fossil fuel or kind of chemical reaction. And so I think that's a really powerful aspect of fission, and that's why we're looking at advanced fission technologies that can recycle and do a lot of things as far as safety.
Thanks. Important question. Yes, sir, here.
Hi, my name is Evan Kindler. I had a question about the kind of physical security of nuclear materials. I know earlier you guys referenced that being located at a base would have kind of its own kind of security positives and negatives, but you also referenced that our current kind of energy supply lines are targeted because of their energy supply lines. How do you envision kind of securing energy supply lines for nuclear that might have kind of, even more of a target on them? And then additionally, when they're in place, how do you plan on dealing with theft and other issues? I don't know if the small modular reactors that are operating in Russia right now, if they've seen any kind of issues with that or how they dealt with that. Thank you.
Yeah, good question. So let's say, I think it's important to note that kind of the problem with a fuel supply is that it's an iterated supply, right? It's a constant stream that you need. So you need these convoys going up. You need these ships, and honestly, this has been a challenge for the military, for the U.S. military, since at least the Civil War. Protecting your supply lines, protecting how you get your energy from your back to the front. I mean, this was the Allied Expeditionary Force in 1944 or 1945. A big issue and a big reason that we were unable to push into Germany in 1944 was because Patton's tanks were dependent on this long supply line of fuel. Now it wasn't being attacked. There wasn't sort of insurgents along there, but it was still a long supply line, and there even was a pipe that they built from England across under the channel that piped fuel, and even that wasn't enough. It was they had all these sorts of things to what's the term? The amateurs think about strategy.
Professionals think logistics.
Professionals think logistics. So it's that sort of stuff. But for a nuclear power plant, it's a one-time thing, right? It's not like you have to continuously be refueling. It's for the Navy, it's a 20-year lifespan for those. Now it depends on design, but I think it's similar ideas for power plants that are being determined here. It's not like they would be continuously refueled. So you'd have to worry about security getting the reactor to base, but it would be fueled as you go there. And the DoD RFI specifically said the idea would be to get it there and get it on base and be able to be producing power within 3 days. So this is a one-time, security challenge that you have to do to get it there. But I think you can protect those and think about that.
Mobility can be an advantage, not just a vulnerability. The fact that you can move it around and people don't know where it is and therefore can't target it. So there's an advantage that I talked about in my artillery battalion. I mean, we moved every night. I mean, we just did it every night, all the time. So with a small modular reactor, if it's truck size, you could move it all the time. Again, you have to protect it. If you're in that area that's got a lot of threats to it. But again, that can be an advantage versus a disadvantage.
Let's go ma'am here, and then we'll go back to you.
My name is Rachel Pake from Partnership for Secure America. And I had a question for Ms. Cochran. You mentioned that the spent fuel at the small modular reactors you're advocating for would be recycled. I wanted if you could please explain what kind of process that you're advocating for, if this would be closing the fuel cycle or pyroprocessing, or what form. I think that needs more clarification. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to be clear that like we're not in our early units trying to make sure to close the fuel cycle exactly. So you would need reprocessing in order to do that. But what we are looking at using is recycled fuel from stores at Idaho, essentially. I think the interesting thing is that can be replicated and done for future core loads, and I'd be happy to talk more about that as well. But it's been demonstrated, and if you're interested in learning more about what they're doing there, I believe that there's resources out there at the Idaho National Laboratory, and they are ongoingly kind of melt and recasting this fuel that was used in a reactor in Idaho there.
Will be our last question, so we can let you all go.
Hi, Carolyn. This is Andrea Janetta with S&P Global Platts. We reported that Oklo was planning to file to NRC an application for a combined operating license. I'm wondering, by the end of the year, I'm wondering if that is still the plan.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that we're looking to be NRC licensed. So what we are actually doing is pursuing a commercial market. So it is actually different. We're not pursuing the transportable reactor thing, and I don't know if that was made clear before I arrived, but there is an incredible market need for this, and so we've been looking to be NRC licensed, and we're not currently pursuing the transportable reactor thing, although we're interested to see how that goes and have offered to share information with it. But we are, there is certainly need for non-transportable power at bases as well.
Great. Well, I think that's a good place to end. We're happy to talk a little bit afterwards if you have further questions. But thank you all for your time. And yeah, go to our website, americansecurityproject.org. This has all been recorded on YouTube, and we'll have it up on there afterwards. And it is Nuclear Science Week. I know there's a number of other events going on for Nuclear Science Week. I think they'll be up on the Hill this afternoon. So please feel free to be involved in that. So thank you all, and thanks for joining us.